Welcome back to Boss Economics World, the only show that calls out the economic clownery of the powers that be, while the rest of the world just nods along like sheep. I'm your host, the no-nonsense, tell-it-like-it-is economic vigilante, here to break down the latest mess our so-called leaders have cooked up. Today, we're diving headfirst into the G7's oil price cap circus. Yes, folks, the one where the US is playing the stubborn ringmaster, Europe's begging for scraps, and Russia's laughing all the way to the bank. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride through economic mismanagement, geopolitical posturing, and the kind of government incompetence that makes you wonder if these people even passed high school math. Oh, folks, where do we even start with this one? The US is digging in its heels, refusing to budge on lowering the price cap on Russian oil sales from $60 to $45 per barrel, leaving Europe hanging like a kid who just got stood up at prom. And why? Because apparently, President Trump, yes, the guy who thinks tariffs are a magic wand, has decided that sticking it to Europe is more important than sticking it to Russia. Meanwhile, oil prices are spiking faster than a TikTok trend. West Texas Intermediate crude futures just jumped 7% to $73 a barrel, and Russia's war machine. Oh, it's humming along just fine, thank you very much, fueled by oil revenues that our brilliant G7 leaders swore they'd choke off. Now, if you're new to Boss Economics World, let me break this down for you in plain English, because unlike those ivory tower economists or government spin doctors, I actually care about making sense to the hardworking folks out there, not just the Wall Street suits. The G7, that exclusive club of developed nations, decided back in 2022 to slap a price cap on Russian oil as a way to starve Putin's war chest while keeping global oil prices from going full on Mad Max. The idea was simple: cap the price at $60 per barrel, enforce it with Western shipping and insurance muscle, and watch Russia squirm. Sounds good on paper, right? Except, as we've said a million times on this show, governments don't do simple, they do stupid. Let's start with the surface-level clownery here, the US refusing to lower the cap. Europe, specifically the EU and UK, are practically on their knees, begging for a $45 cap to tighten the screws on Russia. Why? Because Russia's oil revenues are still flowing like champagne at a hedge fund party, funding tanks, missiles, and all the other toys Putin needs to keep his war in Ukraine going. According to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, CREA, Russia earned a whopping $180 billion in fossil fuel exports in 2024 alone, with oil making up the lion's share. That's right, folks, $180 billion, despite sanctions, despite caps, despite all the chest-thumping from Western leaders about crippling Russia's economy. Now, you'd think the US, as the supposed leader of the free world, would be all in on this. But no, apparently, geopolitics is just a giant game of Risk to the folks in Washington. Sources say the US is worried that lowering the cap would jack up global oil prices even more, alienating voters at home who are already fuming over $4 a gallon gas. Fair enough, but here's the kicker: oil prices are already spiking, thanks to Israel's latest strikes on Iran, which pushed WTI crude up 7% in a single day, the biggest jump since March 2022. So, what's the plan, geniuses? Stick to a cap that's not working, let Russia rake in the cash, and watch oil prices soar anyway. Bravo, folks, bravo. This is classic government logic: refuse to fix a broken policy because fixing it might make things worse, even though doing nothing is already making things worse. And let's not forget the cherry on top: by stonewalling Europe, the US is undermining its own allies at a time when unity against Russia is supposed to be the name of the game. I mean, come on, if you're not going to lead, at least get out of the way. Now, let's give credit where it's due: the EU and UK are at least trying to do something. They've even floated the idea of lowering the cap to $45 without the US, relying on their control over European waters to enforce it. And hey, I admire the moxie: Europe finally growing a spine after years of being Uncle Sam's lapdog is a sight to behold. But let's not kid ourselves: without US enforcement, this is like trying to win a tug of war with one hand tied behind your back. Why? Because the US isn't just a bystander here, it's the muscle. American shipping companies, insurers, and financial institutions are the backbone of the global oil trade. Without them, Russia can just reroute its oil through shadow fleets, which it's already doing, more on that later, or sell to friendly nations like China and India, who couldn't care less about Western caps. In fact, according to the International Energy Agency, IEA, India imported a record 2 million barrels per day of Russian crude in 2024, up from just 0.3 million before the war. China? Oh, they're guzzling 2.2 million barrels a day, making them Russia's top customer. So, Europe can huff and puff all it wants, but without the US on board, this is just performative theater. And let's not forget, Europe's own energy crisis is already a dumpster fire, with natural gas prices still 50% higher than pre-war levels, according to Eurostat. Do they really have the political capital to go it alone, especially when their own citizens are freezing and their industries are shutting down? Doubtful. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the real economic issue here, the one our brilliant leaders refuse to talk about: shadow fleets. Oh, you haven't heard of these? Don't worry, neither have most of the G7 finance ministers, apparently. Shadow fleets are unregistered, uninsured tankers, often old, rickety ships flying flags of convenience, that Russia uses to bypass Western sanctions and price caps. According to Lloyd's List, the maritime intelligence firm, the shadow fleet now accounts for 70% of Russia's seaborne oil exports. That's right, folks, 70%. These ghost ships don't care about your $60 cap, your $45 cap, or your sanctimonious G7 summits. They sail merrily along, delivering oil to anyone who'll buy it, often at prices above the cap, because buyers like China and India know they've got the West over a barrel, pun intended. And here's the kicker: the US and its allies have done almost nothing to crack down on this. Why? Because it's hard, messy, and might involve actual enforcement, something our governments are allergic to. Now, let's zoom out to the bigger picture, because this oil cap fiasco isn't just about Russia or geopolitics, it's about the global economy, and guess what? It's a mess, and it's our government's fault. Oil prices spiking to $73 a barrel isn't just a headline, it's a dagger to the heart of an already wobbly recovery. According to the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, global growth is projected to slow to 2.7% in 2025, down from 3.2% in 2024, thanks in part to persistent inflation and, you guessed it, energy price shocks. And who's to blame? Oh, let's see, the same governments that botched the oil cap policy, the same governments that printed trillions during the pandemic, the same governments that thought sanctions would magically solve everything without any collateral damage. Inflation in the US is still hovering at 3.5%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and in the Eurozone, it's at 2.8%, per Eurostat, both well above central bank targets. And now, with oil prices surging, you can bet your bottom dollar that inflation's going to get worse, interest rates are going to stay high, and consumers are going to get squeezed even harder. But hey, don't worry, folks, the G7 leaders are off to their fancy summit in Canada, sipping champagne and patting each other on the back, while the rest of us are left wondering how we're going to afford groceries. This is what happens when you let bureaucrats and politicians play chess with the global economy, they knock over the board and call it a victory. So, what's the solution? Oh, you know I've got one, because unlike our fearless leaders, I actually think about this stuff. First, the US needs to stop grandstanding and get on board with the $45 cap. Yes, it might push oil prices up in the short term, but the alternative is letting Russia fund its war indefinitely while prices spike anyway. Second, crack down on the shadow fleets, seize those ships, sanction the insurers, and make it impossible for Russia to bypass the cap. Third, invest in energy independence. Europe, I'm looking at you. You've had 3 years since the Ukraine war started to wean yourselves off Russian energy, and you're still whining about high prices? Pathetic. And finally, for the love of all that is holy, stop treating sanctions like a PR stunt. If you're going to do them right, enforce them, monitor them, and adjust them when they're not working. Because right now, the only thing being sanctioned is the intelligence of the people who came up with this plan. Folks, this G7 oil cap debacle is a perfect microcosm of everything wrong with government economic management: arrogance, incompetence, and a complete disregard for the people they're supposed to serve. While Russia laughs, Europe freezes, and the US postures, the global economy is teetering on the edge of another recession, and all we get from our leaders is silence or excuses. So, to my viewers, whether you're a hardworking family trying to make ends meet or a finance pro watching the markets implode, remember this: the government isn't here to save you. They're too busy saving face. It's up to us to call out the nonsense, demand better, and take control of our own financial futures. That's all for today, folks. If you liked this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and share it with everyone you know who's sick of economic clownery. And remember, here at Boss Economics World, we don't just report the news, we expose the fools making it. See you next time.